Now, I really feel for Jeremiah. God didn't give him a very easy job. And as you can tell by the opening words in the story of Jeremiah tried to get out of it. He tried to get out of being a preacher, a prophet, and he tried it by doing the same trick that Moses did. I don't know how to speak, for I'm only a boy, he said. Now, whether Jeremiah was very young when he felt God's call, or whether it was sometime later and he just used that as an excuse for his inexperience, God, of course, had a way around it. He reached out, touched Jeremiah's lips, and God put words in his mouth. You know what God called Jeremiah to do? It was a preacher's nightmare. He's supposed to talk to all the nations, all the people, not just Israel and Judah. And it was a dark and difficult task he was called to do. Now, Jeremiah was called to preach during a really difficult time in Israel's history. These were the last tumultuous days before they were captured by the Babylonians and enslaved. And so for that time period, for 40 years, he spoke the word of the Lord to the powers and the people who were headed for national and personal disaster, even though they didn't know it. That was what was hinted when they talked about the tribes of the north coming down. And he said, "Let those who have ears to hear the word of the Lord." Now, we're in the season of Epiphany. It's supposed to be the season of living in the light. And so we might be wondering, where is the light in this dark passage? Think about that lesson from last week where Jesus was preaching in his hometown, telling them that God sent him to the nations to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow. They weren't words that anybody in his hometown wanted to hear, and the next thing we knew, Jesus was running for his life. Well, what happened to Jesus echoes what happened to others, like Daniel that the youth choir sang about, like Jonah and Jeremiah. It's tough to be a prophetic preacher, to be a prophet. In a ministry like Jeremiah's, it must be deeply rooted in God's word. And the thing is, though, it's not just about preaching. It's not just about being a prophet. It's about being and living in a life of faith. It's about God's call to each one of us, each individual, and as the church. We can't take on the powers that be out there unless we're sure that we are rooted in God's word, unless we're speaking God's word, not just our own personal opinion. Jeremiah and Jesus were sure. They knew. Jeremiah wasn't making a career choice when he undertook the ministry of hard words. He said, "The word of the Lord came to me," basically kind of saying, well, it's not my choice. But we also have to realize, if we look a little bit deeper at this passage, that Jeremiah's words were not always going to be harsh. He's assigned, yes, to pluck up and pull down, but then he's assigned to build and to plant. So, if you think about it, oftentimes there has to be a tear down in order to start fresh. We know this working with Habitat buildings when we're donated a home. Sometimes we have to tear out the whole interior in order to make it be a safe and comfortable home. Sometimes we have to tear it down to the foundations. That's what happens when we renovate our houses and when we want to make changes in our own lives. I think this passage, though it is about the greater history of Israel, can also be very personal to us. I think it might be asking us, Is there a place in your life where you want to make a change? And of course, we've been resisting it because change doesn't happen easily. And change doesn't happen until we can find out what may be broken or needs renovation and tear it down and get rid of it. I know I've got some tearing down of my own to do. It's always something new for each one of us. So I think it may be more helpful to think about removing obstacles and debris in our own lives rather than trying to make change. If we can be honest, we can admit that there are obstacles in all of our lives. There are obstacles that basically prevent us living a life full of God's grace. Jeremiah could have tossed up all sorts of obstacles to God. All he had to do was keep his mouth shut, and life would just go on. But then his life would have been a half-life. Do we want a half-life for ourselves or for our church? Jeremiah's, Jesus' work, their work wasn't always just about tearing down. But that had to happen so that planting, building, and growing could happen. And I think ultimately that's what we're called to be. Planters, growers, builders, renovators, if you will. But none of that can happen in our own lives or in church or in whatever we're doing at work. None of that can happen if we're trying to build on shaky foundations or uneven ground. So I think perhaps Jeremiah might ask us, instead of trying to talk to the nations, would ask us to consider what each one of us would like in our own life. Consider what life you want to see, how your life can be built. Maybe you've had dreams that have been cast aside but not quite forgotten. You might be able to dust them off and resurrect them. Consider what life we want to see in our congregation. What kind of life do we want for our nation, for our world? We're not being asked to be like Jeremiah, thank God, but we are called into relationship with God. And so God gives us the inspiration and the hope that we need to do the hard things, but also the hope that we need to move forward. And we begin our first steps again as we come today to the table where we meet Jesus. Jesus, who gives us the hope, who lifts us when we're falling, who builds us up with his grace every moment of every day. So we start again today so that tomorrow we may be builders and growers and planters as well.